you.
Give my email.
Yeah, I said okay, yeah. Monica should have one. Okay. Cool. Yep.
Don't worry, Michael, I'll ask a question for you. Yeah. Was that just your permission to be mean?
That was my problem. That was like res life plus one. I think there was one person there that wasn't res life.
$1080's not gonna work. 768 is as wide as you're gonna get.
Do you want to finish watching Sophia, or do you want to go back to Mom's office?
Go back to Mom's office.
I'll be watching on YouTube.
That's one of the reasons why we have it.
You're good.
Check the refresh rate. It's got to be 60.
What's your resolution at?
1366 by 7.
1024.
Yeah.
Oh, delightful. You don't want to keep it?
I mean, I could, but I figured you might want.
I have a ton of them.
I'll keep it.
What?
I'm so upset you didn't put his face on your reference
Yes.
display.
I thought about it.
It was to ruin
I thought about it.
with us.
You should put him on your poster, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
There we go. First 4 minutes of Mike's recording is just him messing around with his computer.
Are you recording it, like saving it?
Yeah.
Will you put them on YouTube, or is there some other way I could get a copy to my mom?
I can get you copies.
That'd be
I'm not
really
sure if we're gonna post them to YouTube or not, but I was asked.
Least possible. That's the phrase I was looking for.
It came to her. Just so
Wait.
you know.
Just so that I know.
Just so you know.
I gotta cut all those. I just thought we're pretty much where it works.
And
Because
then
all the good
start
stuff,
getting-
like UCM almost smartly.
Have, like, we have to figure it out. It's just
You can't keep it in for.
It's SMP presentations.
That was really weird. That doesn't happen normally. Okay.
There's a sign on the door, too.
Yeah, it's like, yeah.
Alan, I have a question about graph theory. Oh, never mind. I'll talk to you later.
I have
Okay.
questions about graph theory.
No, my question was your question, Mike.
What? Alright, 1 second. Let me move my thinking here. All right.
Ready? Go for it.
Okay. Thanks for coming, everybody. I can't say I've been more nervous for a presentation since middle school. Here we go. I'm Mike Harp, and I did my SMP on the educational benefits of Raspberry Pi within the college classroom. So, to start us off, my SMP started, and I asked Dr. Jameson a simple question one day, watching Sean as TA in 201 lecture, something about RSA encryption, I think, or Q's, one or the other. And I asked him, could I possibly make my SMP about lecturing introductory courses? And it grew from there into this idea of using the Raspberry Pi to sort of enable education and see if it could actually benefit people within the classroom. From there, it sort of developed into this 3-week lecture series within ComSci 251, which is programming languages within the Python module of that class. And the Pi fit very well within Python because it has integrated support for Python, and because there's so many ComSci majors here now. 251 was divided into 2 sections this year. One section in the afternoon, which would be my experimental Raspberry Pi group, and one session in the evening, which would be the control group taught by Sean and Molly. Both groups were monitored by Dr. Jameson to ensure course content. And basically the ultimate goal was to use the Pi within Python to help teach it and determine if it had an impact on programming aptitude. So, in order to actually get into this, we have to get a little history of the Pi and figure out what it's all about. So the Raspberry Pi began development in 2006. It was started in the University of Cambridge's computer laboratory by a group of researchers headed by a man named Eben Upton, very British, a lot of them. The idea sort of spawned out of this argument that children were being brought up, especially in the UK and even here, just knowing the basics of software programming. So you would come into school and you would grow up knowing how to use Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, all of these software programs. But in reality, this doesn't really give you any knowledge of computing or how a computer works on the inside, or really any marketable skills for that matter. Everyone can use Microsoft Word. So the goal was to sort of bring back this interest and this sort of excitement for computing and learning about computing, while at the same time maintaining accessibility by providing a low-cost machine that could be programmable. So Upton and his group of cronies founded the Raspberry Pi Foundation and began developing their single-board computer. They eventually released February 29th of 2012 to great success. They sold out their initial production run within minutes. Their website reportedly crashed because of all the web traffic. And as of February 2014, in just 2 years, they had sold over 2.5 million Pis at around $40 a piece on a couple of websites, Amazon mostly. So since its release, one might ask exactly what has been done with the Raspberry Pi since it's come out into the open, and where is its spot in computer science education exactly, since that's what we're talking about here. So within its native United Kingdom, the Raspberry Pi has seen a great deal of influence in the classroom. It was sponsored by Google and a number of other companies that actually put it into classrooms and give it funding. But it's drawn some criticisms, mainly from some reporters in the UK, who cited that the Pi, though it has a great idea, really is falling back and is gathering dust on shelves for a number of reasons. The primary reason is that funding issue. The government does not want to fund computer schools to set up these new computer labs in an attempt to reteach all these kids how to actually compute and do electronics. It sort of ended up being that only the most wealthy and private schools in England could actually maintain and acquire enough Pis to run a reasonable lab. Another problem was that even if the government were to fund these Pis and give them out to schools, the problem would be that teachers don't actually know how to teach with them. A number of manuals have been published for the Pi, education in the Raspberry Pi, but the problem with these is they're really geared towards teaching yourself how to program and how to do electronics work, while at the same time exploring the Raspberry Pi, not utilizing the Pi to teach others and to teach children. So these are a number of problems that went along in the United Kingdom. In order to solve them, a number of startups have come about. One that's pictured here is the Kano computer kit. Kano was a startup, I think it's also based in the UK, like everything else in this project. It basically offers children a fun and exciting way to build your own Raspberry Pi computer. It has everything you need, sans a screen, has a keyboard for built-in touchpad, Wi-Fi dongles, all the cables you need, and then various instructions on like how to build a game or how to set up networks, things like that. Like I said, Kano was funded on Kickstarter. It seems to be a great success. It'll probably be released later this year, I think. Their initial goal for funding of $100,000 was met pretty well by $1.5 million of funding. So I'm excited to see if they can actually get into use somewhere. Outside the United Kingdom for once, the Pi has been used in many international humanitarian efforts to sort of help enable education for the less privileged people of the world. The Raspberry Pi Foundation cites sort of drives in places like Cambodia and Ghana and Afghanistan, where a number of volunteer groups have actually bought numerous Pis and kits and set them up for these people, targeting poor children who don't have any access to computing technology, trying to benefit their lives. As for the United States, the Pi really hasn't seen any at all integration into the classroom. Upon doing research, I only turned up one foundation, the small foundation called the Rural Technology Fund out in the Midwest, which was seeking to put Pis in the classrooms to help give children access to technology that they wouldn't otherwise have. Other than that, the Pi is really only in the DIY electronics community in the US. Talks about putting it in classrooms really haven't gone anywhere. Besides from that, actual use of the Pi within college classrooms, I found no resources at all, no records at all. So besides Dr. Jameson's topics class, I guess that was last semester, it seems like forever ago, where we used the Pi a little bit. It really hasn't seen any integration with the college classroom at all. So this really speaks to the unique nature of my study and how we can actually see an emerging technology and its effects on a course and how it might be used. So that all being said, what can this Pi actually do? So turning to technical specs, the Raspberry Pi comes in two distinct models. Model A has everything Model B does, but it has half the memory, no LAN Ethernet port, and only one USB port. Model B, which is the model that we used within the lecture series of programming languages, comes with basically everything you need to run a computer, all the necessary peripherals. It has a LAN port for internet, 2 USB ports, mice, keyboard, cameras, you name it, they got it. HDMI port for audio and visuals. It's powered by a micro USB charger, so same thing you plug your phone into at night, it can run a hand-sized computer. And it also boots Linux off of an SD card. So there's a number of flavors of Linux out there for Pis. We use the Raspbian version of Linux, but there are also Linux versions out there designed just to act as media centers or just as your run-of-the-mill computing centers. So the most intriguing and probably crucial part of the Pi here is going to be these GPIO pins, which are pictured here. The GPIO pins are fully programmable with Python, I might add, making them a good fit for the course. Using them and a little bit of code, you can pretty much prototype up any electronics project you can think of. Clothes that heat themselves, speakers, etc., etc. So, because it was so integrated with Python and because Python enabled it so well to do so many things, it really fit well into this Python module of programming languages. That's where we aimed it at. So getting to the actual lecture work, I had a lot of things to cover. The main challenge was to sort of cover all these points of Python while at the same time including the Pi in some meaningful and additive way. This meant having to design work around the Pi and dividing class time sort of into half of it going towards just actual Python conceptual lecturing, and the other half attempting to fit in Raspberry Pi and its place in all this scheme. So the main targets of teaching Python for us were what Dr. Jameson calls the seven basic structures of a programming language. These include types and typing, which is for Python basically it's implicit yet strong duck typing. Control structures, which any programmer will tell you is just how a programming language controls the flow of a program. This includes, conditional statements like if or else, while loops, for loops, etc. Scoping, basically variable life, how variables work within a program. Python's all done by indentation. Expression resolution, which really just brought up a discussion of the difference between statements and expressions within Python. That's a whole bunch of mess we don't have to get into right now. Error handling, which pretty self-explanatory, just states how a programming language handles errors being thrown while code is running. Python uses the classic sort of try, catch setup, except it's called try, except in this case. Data passing, which is again how information is shuffled along within a program while it's running. Python does it primarily by reference. And finally, abstraction, which refers not only to how a program defines functions, but also object-orientedness, classes, inheritance, and all that existential mumbo jumbo. So there was really a lot to go into here. The Raspberry Pi sections sort of targeted and showed how you could integrate Python into Pi and what you could do with it. These came along with topics of how to do things in a Linux terminal, because everyone should know how to work Linux, especially if you're working with Pi. What kind of projects you can do. There was also a number of assignments that were given out. There was one lab assignment assigned to the students, which involved using the Raspberry Pi and Python to run and light a RGB LED. There was also 3 projects that were being done. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and look at this assignment. So this is the RGB LED lab assignment that was designed. Basically, students had to create a GUI slider like the one shown, wherein if you drag the bars, it would change the color ratios on the LED. There's each leg of the LED corresponds to a different color. And so if you set up the pins correctly in Python, you can change the colors as you will, or as the GUI will. This assignment really tried to get the students to comprehend how you can use libraries within Python to do just about anything. To do this assignment and nearly all the electronics assignments for the Pi, you need a library called rpi.gpio, basically Raspberry Pi GPIO. And through that library, you can program the pins on the Raspberry Pi. The little blue thing on there is called the cobbler. You can see it plugged into my Pi over here, if you're not too far away. Basically just breaks out the pins and lets you get at them and wire them accordingly. So, as for the ever alluded to projects for the course, there were 3 projects that were developed. They were implemented before lecturing started for 251 to make sure that there was some healthy balance of both coding and Pi work, as well as difficulty. If I couldn't do the project, how could I on good conscience assign it to my kids, So each group was supplied with necessary parts and instructions, hints, and tips from me. The first project we're going to go over, which I actually have set up over here, is Raspberry Pi Internet Radio. And basically the goal of this project was to create a web radio streamer that would not only play the music that you specified, but actually break out the radio station onto an LCD screen. It also has a little button that will cycle through radio stations. I'm going to turn mine up a little bit over here. And then you can change stations. Theoretically, it'll work. So that's a pretty cool project. It was designed mainly such that groups could, again, utilize Python libraries and actually use them to communicate with the Raspberry Pi and Linux operating system. There's another Python library called OS, which allows you to directly send terminal commands from a program. So using this, it was sort of an attempt to get people to understand how programs not only communicate just through you, through the window of text, but also through the actual hardware you're working with. The next project was a Raspberry Pi version of Simon, the classic game of Simon, where it flashes a sequence of lights at you and you click the buttons corresponding to the lights to repeat it back. And as the game goes on, it gets progressively faster and the sequence gets progressively longer. So students also had to implement this. Each student, they were only 2 groups did this one. We'll get into that for the work section, but 2 groups did this one separately. Each group was also supplied with the circuit diagram. I'm not sure if I mentioned that initially, but again, this project sort of targeted using Python libraries like GPIO, along with some heavy control structures to actually run these electronic buttons, which need some fancy while loops and various things to actually get them working to your liking. The last project was a Raspberry Pi security system. It ran a USB webcam that, when detected motion, would trigger an alarm with the little piezo speaker, the big black circle up there. Once the alarm had been triggered, a user would have to punch in a pin with the 4 buttons to turn it off. The pin was also required to be changeable within the GUI that they developed for it. And again, this was to show that Python really helps you to integrate within an operating system and sort of start running the motion service that they have chosen to use in the first place. So once lecturing had been completed and everybody had presented their projects quite well, to add, I might add, they were issued a skill assessment on the last day of lecture for me. This was an institutional review board approved skill assessment. It included questions that were in ranging difficulties, everything from what kind of typing does Python have, which I said earlier in this presentation, all the way up to defining functions recursively to define factorials of numbers. So, students were given 30 minutes to complete the skill assessment. Anyone could leave at any time, of course. And both the control group and my experimental section were both given a skill assessment. So as for the actual results, not as brilliant as turned out. Dr. Jameson graded the skill tests. As you can see, my section scored an average of 77.2, while the control group scored an 85.6. I ran a t-test on this data. I got back a p-value of 0.032, meaning that the data is fairly significant. So the question then becomes, with negative results like this, how do we quantify, not quantify, but how do we sort of rectify and wrap up this sort of study and see where it leads us? So I've come about a number of ways to sort of explain these negative results. First and foremost, I learned after talking with a number of physics professors this morning at the poster session that we could have done a lot more correlative testing. We could have done some pre-tests and some post-tests, and I would have liked to have done a sort of comparison of actual end grades for the class versus skill assessment grades to see if one class was really above par of the other one. Other than that, I think the main point comes down to these project differences. So the control group had the classic Jameson Python project, which is you get 4 pretty intense, complex, classical program problem-solving questions, and you have to do all of them. And so this really speaks to, it may just be that when it comes to answering programming concepts, then programming problem-solving practice really can't be beat for that sort of experience. But this sort of alludes to my final point about this, is that there's a fundamental sort of inherent difference between this conceptual knowledge of Python and what was gained by working with the Pis. So by working with the pies, the students got to actually touch components and they got to actually see the connection between code and product. And this sort of glimpses at the real world of programming. One of the biggest complaints within the comp sci department is that there's always this discrepancy between what we do in class, where we program up these big data structures and various things like that, and what we would actually do in the real world, or what we can actually do in reality for ourselves. And so I think that the Raspberry Pi section helped students 251 to sort of grasp this bottom-up knowledge of programming. And I got a number of really positive responses from students in the class. Particularly what students said, I thought the class was very informative on many levels. Coupling a traditional lecture of hands-on experience with electronics made the course very applied and extremely useful in industry. And so it's responses like these that seem to place the Raspberry Pi experiment in the area of success for me, despite the quantitative data. But that might be left up for further work. Further work, of course, I would have loved to have more time to lecture, to actually teach some electronics stuff. I think it would have been really rewarding, but hopefully they would go on to take a topics class of Alan and get to mess around with stuff like I did. There was a fourth project planned in the beginning, which was going to be a Raspberry Pi guitar tuner, which would sample real-time sound and compare it against sound wave frequencies, and then flash LEDs to tell you if you're flat, sharp, or pitch perfect. And I got everything to work on this project and then put it all together and nothing would work. So I would love to go back and finish that project because it was a really cool idea, and you never know when you need a guitar tuner when you have your Raspberry Pi on hand. Other than that, I hope to be employed when I graduate somewhere with something involving computational education. And I think that this project would really be indispensable experience in that area. So, in conclusion, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out. I'd like to thank Alan for putting up with me through this Odyssean journey of an SMP. And I'd like to thank the Elder Gods for the wonderful weather we had today. Other than that, thank you. Any questions?
Questions for Mike?
One of the things that, like, we were talking about, like, how you have negative results for the scores. One of the things you mentioned was, like, didn't have as many. There weren't a whole lot of people actually involved in the experiment. And I was actually kind of curious, since the IRB test was optional, of course, how many actual evaluations did you get back?
I have to check my paper over there. I think the class size was around 15 for our experimental group and maybe around 12 or 11 for the control. I don't quite remember. It was definitely the teens for both of them. I know that nobody just stood up and said, no, I don't want to take your skill assessment, and threw it at me and left. So everybody took it. It was just very small classes.
Not everybody took it in the control.
Oh, well. They were not influenced by my charm then.
Other questions for Mike for new additions? There are a couple of questions from the live stream.